Medieval Europe wasn't run by government the way we think of it today. It ran on land, loyalty, and a chain of promises that decided who worked, who fought, and who ruled. In this video, we break down the feudal system into 8 clear levels, from the people in the fields to the king at the top, and show how this hierarchy powered medieval life and medieval warfare. Number 1. Serfs and the bound land. Before sunrise, the lowest layer of medieval society was already moving, because the manor ran on routine. A serf's life sat inside the manorial system, a lord's estate with fields, pasture, woodland, a mill, and a village. Serfs, often called villains in England, weren't property the way ancient slaves were, but they were legally unfree, meaning their rights were limited by custom and by the lord's court. The biggest rule was simple: they were tied to the land. If the manor changed hands, the serf usually stayed. Leaving without permission could bring fines or being dragged back, and even marriage might require a payment known as a merchet in some places. In exchange for the right to live in a hut and farm strips in the village fields, a serf owed labor services, rents, and dues. The labor part is what surprises modern viewers. Several days each week working the lord's domain, the lord's own land, before they could focus on their own crops. That work could be plowing, planting, harvesting, ditching, carting, or repairing roads and fences. On top of that came in-kind rents grain, eggs, cheese, wool plus cash payments when coin was available, and church tithes that took a slice of the harvest too. Then there were the everyday little fees that added up, paying to use the lord's mill to grind grain, paying for access to the oven or wine press in some regions, paying a fine in the manorial court if you broke customary rules. Even a death could trigger a payment, because the lord claimed a best animal or best item in certain areas. None of this was abstract. It shaped what you ate, how much seed you could save, and whether your family could survive a bad year. Medieval farming itself was demanding. Many villages used the open field system, huge shared fields divided into strips with crop rotation. One field planted, another left fallow, to keep soil from collapsing. Serfs had rights too, grazing animals on common land, collecting firewood, sometimes fishing, sometimes gathering nuts or berries. Those rights mattered because they were the difference between scraping by and real hunger. A serf's world was local and narrow. The village, the lord's hall, the church, the fields, and the edge of the forest. Warfare and politics still hit them hard, because armies ate like storms. When a lord prepared for a campaign, he needed grain, fodder for horses, carts, and labor to maintain roads and bridges. Even if serfs weren't marching as soldiers, their work fed the men who did. That's why serfs were the base of the whole feudal pyramid. Every armored rider, every castle garrison, and every siege train depended on steady food supply, animals, and taxes produced at the bottom. The protection bargain was real too. In a world of raids, feuds, and shaky law enforcement, being inside a lord's territory could mean safety compared to being alone. Still, protection came with control. Lords held courts, settled disputes, and punished theft or disobedience, but they also used those courts to enforce labor and rents. Over time, the balance changed. After big population shocks like the Black Death, labor became more valuable, and in many places, lords started commuting labor duties into money rents. That shift didn't instantly free people, but it shows the key point. Serfdom wasn't a single, frozen system across all medieval Europe. It was a range of obligations that evolved as money, cities, and labor markets grew. Number 2. Free peasants and early choice. Free peasants often looked almost identical to serfs, which is why they're easy to misunderstand. The difference was legal status. A free peasant could, at least in theory, choose where to live and work, bargain over rents, and take a dispute to higher courts instead of being trapped entirely inside the lord's jurisdiction. That freedom mattered most during crisis. If harvests failed, if taxes spiked, or if a lord became abusive, free peasants had options: migrate, seek better terms, or move toward towns where wages and markets existed. They still carried burdens. Medieval life was heavy for everyone, but the direction of the pressure was different. Instead of owing fixed labor days on the lord's domain, Free peasants usually paid rent, coin when available, crops when coin was scarce, or services only in special cases. This created a different relationship with the economy. Once money rents become normal, people start thinking in budgets, not just obligations. A free household might decide to plant a higher value crop, raise more sheep for wool, or sell surplus at a market to cover rents and buy tools. That's the beginning of a mindset that slowly weakens classic feudal ties. Some free peasants became yeoman-independent small landowners who could hire laborers, store grain, and invest in better equipment. Others formed village communities with stronger bargaining power, using customary rights and collective action to negotiate with landlords. Their freedom didn't mean comfort. They still faced famine years, disease, and war. A marching army didn't care whether a farm was free or unfree when it needed food. But free status could shape the aftermath. If a region was devastated, free peasants were more likely to relocate and rebuild elsewhere, while serfs were expected to stay and restore production for the manor. Free peasants also mattered for medieval warfare in a quieter way. As money spread, kings and lords relied more on taxes and paid troops. That demanded reliable cash flow, markets, and people used to thinking in rent and coin. In places where free peasants were common, you often see faster growth of market towns and a quicker shift toward wage labor. Another useful detail is that free peasant covers a lot of variation. Some were smallholders with just enough land to feed a family. Some had larger holdings and real local influence. Some held land by charters that spelled out rights and duties. In Scandinavia and parts of the Alps, free farmers could be especially strong, sometimes forming assemblies and militias. Across Europe, the pattern is consistent. Even limited freedom created breathing room, and breathing room created mobility, savings, and the ability to say no in a world built on people being unable to refuse. Number 3. The low clergy among the people. The low clergy parish priests, monks, friars, and nuns were the social glue of medieval villages and towns. If you want to understand medieval society, you have to understand that religion wasn't a hobby on weekends. It organized time, law, and identity. The parish church tracked births, marriages, and deaths through sacraments. A priest baptized infants, blessed unions, heard confession, and administered last rites. That gave the clergy enormous authority because they were gatekeepers of salvation in the medieval imagination. Even when villagers complained about fees or moral failures, the church still framed what people believed was happening to their souls. The low clergy also functioned as the local information system. Sermons spread news, warnings, and moral lessons. Church calendars set work rhythms with feast days and fasting days. Saints' days and festivals gave people breaks from grinding labor. Monasteries added another layer. Benedictine and later orders like the Cistercians built disciplined communities that worked, prayed, and managed land. Many monasteries became efficient economic centers. They ran farms, mills, vineyards, and workshops, sometimes offering employment and relief during hard seasons. They also preserved and produced knowledge. In scriptoria, monks copied manuscripts, religious texts, medical notes, histories, and classical works at a time when many nobles and soldiers were illiterate or only partially literate. That matters for warfare too. Written records, legal charters, and correspondence helped rulers manage taxes and mobilize resources. Monasteries also provided practical services. Some offered hospitality to travelers, care for the sick, and alms to the poor. In cities, mendicant friars moved among crowded neighborhoods, preaching, teaching, and sometimes calming unrest. The low clergy weren't just spiritual figures, they were mediators and community managers. When disputes erupted over land boundaries, inheritance, or marital conflicts, clergy often played a role because they understood canon law and had access to written norms. At the same time, their power could create friction. Tithes took food from households already struggling. Some priests lived humbly. Others acted like minor landlords. Reform movements inside the church repeatedly tried to fix corruption, showing that medieval people noticed hypocrisy, not just modern audiences. The most important point is influence. In a society where people believed God actively shaped fortune, The priest's words could weigh as much as a noble's sword. A war could be explained as divine punishment or divine favor. A defeat could be framed as moral failure. That kind of explanation shaped how communities responded, whether they resisted, endured, or rallied behind leaders. Number 4. Burghers and the rise of trade power. Burgherstown merchants, master craftsmen, and guild leaders were the group that quietly rewired medieval society from the inside. Feudal status was supposed to be built on land. Who owned it? Who worked it? Who could demand service from it? Burghers built power from trade, skill, and cash. As towns expanded, they became magnets for people seeking opportunity. Runaway serfs trying to disappear into crowded streets, free peasants selling surplus, and ambitious apprentices hoping to become masters. Town life ran on contracts and payments. That alone was a challenge to feudal thinking. Many towns secured charters granting rights like holding markets, collecting tolls, and governing locally through councils. These charters mattered because they limited a lord's ability to interfere, and they protected the economic engine that towns represented. Inside towns, guilds controlled training, product quality, and pricing. A blacksmith, armorer, or weaver wasn't just a worker. In a guild system, skill became a kind of membership card into stable income and local influence. This connects directly to medieval warfare. Knights still mattered, but war increasingly depended on supplies. Arrows, crossbows, helmets, horseshoes, rope, wagons, salt meat, and later, gunpowder weapons. Town workshops produced these essentials, and merchants moved them along trade routes. The more organized the trade networks, the more reliable the war machine. Burghers also shaped the financial side. They developed credit practices, partnerships, and bookkeeping that let rulers raise money faster than traditional feudal dues could provide. A king who could tax towns or borrow from merchants could hire soldiers directly. That's a major shift. Paid infantry, mercenaries, and later professional armies reduced the king's dependence on noble levies. Burghers didn't usually ride into battle as armored cavalry, but they financed campaigns, built city walls, and sometimes formed town militias to defend their own interests. Their influence shows up in the way power starts to follow money. A rich merchant could negotiate with nobles, marry into minor nobility, or buy offices and privileges. Towns also connected Europe to wider worlds through fairs, ports, and long-distance trade, bringing in spices, fine cloth, metals, and new ideas. Over time, that flow created pressure on the old pyramid. If a merchant can fund a castle's expansion, supply an army, and lend to a king, birth alone stops being the only path to authority. The feudal system doesn't vanish overnight, but the rise of burghers adds a second power structure running alongside it, one based on commerce, paperwork, and cash. Number 5. Knights and armored power. Knights were the most recognizable face of medieval power, but they were also a job category with rules, costs, and constant pressure. A knight didn't just appear with a sword and a horse. He was built through a long pipeline. As a page, a boy learned manners, basic weapons handling, and how a noble household actually worked. As a squire, training became physical and practical riding in armor, caring for horses, maintaining equipment, and learning battlefield habits like staying in formation and protecting a lord. That last part mattered because medieval combat was often chaotic, and discipline could be the difference between winning and getting surrounded. Knighthood was tied to land and service. In theory, a lord granted a fief, and the knight owed military service, usually a set number of days per year. In practice, the system was flexible. Some knights held land, others were household knights, paid in wages, food, and status, and many mixed both. The biggest misunderstanding is that chivalry ran everything. Chivalry was real as an ideal. Honor, loyalty, mercy to certain opponents, protection of the church, but the battlefield rewarded effectiveness. Knights fought for reputation, but also for survival, ransoms, and future opportunities. Ransom culture is one of the most useful details for viewers. Capturing a wealthy enemy could be worth more than killing him. That shaped tactics and explains why nobles sometimes treated noble prisoners relatively well. At the same time, common soldiers didn't get that treatment. which made medieval warfare brutally unequal. Armor was another reality check. A full kit could include padded gambeson, mail, helmet, and later plate elements. Even a simple mail hauberk required skilled labor and time, and good steel was expensive. Horses were not just animals. They were military equipment, and war horses were costly to buy and maintain. A knight also needed a support system: grooms, squires, spare tack, and reliable supply. That's why wealth was so tightly linked to knighthood. The romantic image of the lone warrior hides the economic truth. A knight was a mobile weapons platform, funded by land, rents, and peasants' labor. Tactically, knights were most dangerous when they could use speed and mass. A heavy cavalry charge could break infantry that lacked training, cohesion, or proper formation. But knights were not unbeatable. A muddy field, a narrow bridge, a ditch, or disciplined infantry with long spears could stop them cold. Over time, the knight advantage shrank as armies learned better formations, and as missile weapons like longbows and crossbows became more organized on the battlefield. Still, for centuries, knights sat near the center of medieval armies because they were reliable shock troops and symbols of authority. For the people below them, that symbol cut both ways. Knights could protect villages from raiders, but they could also be the ones enforcing rents, taking supplies in wartime, or crushing revolts. Their loyalty was valuable, but also dangerous. If a lord failed to reward them, a knight could switch sides, join a rival, or become a violent local problem. Number 6. The high clergy and sacred authority. If the low clergy shaped daily life, the high clergy shaped the political map. Bishops, archbishops, and major abbots weren't just spiritual leaders. They were major landholders and power brokers. Many controlled territories with villages, farms, and rights to collect taxes and rents, sometimes on the scale of great nobles. This is why medieval cathedrals weren't only religious buildings. They were public statements of authority, wealth, and permanence. The high clergy often sat on royal councils, served as diplomats, and managed administration because they were among the most educated people in Europe. Literacy and record-keeping were power. A bishop who could write letters, draft charters, and interpret law could outmaneuver warriors who relied mainly on force. High clergy also held the keys to legitimacy. Kings wanted coronations performed by senior churchmen because anointing and blessing made rule feel approved by God. That matters for understanding medieval obedience. Many people believed rebellion wasn't just political crime, it was spiritual danger unless it could be justified. The church could also weaponize that legitimacy by denying it. Excommunication or interdict cutting regions off from sacraments could pressure rulers and nobles without a single sword drawn. It's hard to overstate how serious that was in a society where salvation was central. At the same time, the church wasn't a single, perfectly united machine. Bishops competed with nobles, abbots competed with bishops, and kings tried to appoint loyal clergy to key positions. In some regions, control over appointments became a major political struggle, because whoever chose bishops indirectly controlled land, income, and influence. High clergy also intersected with warfare in direct ways. Some bishops led troops, and many financed military campaigns through church revenues. Crusades show the extreme version, where religious goals were tied to military mobilization, but even local wars could be framed in moral language. The church could bless banners, grant special permissions, and shape the story of why a war was right. That narrative mattered for recruitment and loyalty. For ordinary people, high clergy could feel distant compared to the parish priest, but their decisions, taxes, tithes, political alliances still hit villages through demands for money and supplies. And when corruption appeared, it wasn't minor. Rich bishoprics and abbeys could become targets for ambitious families who wanted church offices for income. That tension is part of why reform movements kept appearing. People knew sacred authority was powerful, and they wanted it to look sacred. Number 7. Great nobles and regional power. Great nobles, dukes, counts, major barons were the king's partners and rivals at the same time. The feudal idea says nobles hold land from the king and serve him, but the practical truth is that power lived where soldiers, castles, and money were. A great noble might control a region's best farmland, key river crossings, and fortified towns, giving him the ability to collect tolls, taxes, and rents like a mini-state. Castles were not just homes. They were tools of control. They protected storehouses, guarded roads, and served as bases for garrisons that could respond quickly to local unrest. Castles also represented law. Nobles held courts, settled disputes, and punished crime, which made them feel like the real government for most people. When a king demanded an army, great nobles mattered because they could raise knights, sergeants, and foot soldiers quickly. They also controlled logistics, carts, food stores, and safe routes. That's why royal power often rose and fell based on relationships with nobles. A loyal duke could stabilize a border. A hostile one could split a kingdom. This is where medieval politics becomes personal. Oaths mattered, but so did marriages, hostages, rivalries, and old grudges. If a noble felt insulted, threatened, or underpaid, he might break faith and ally with another lord, even a foreign king. Civil wars and baronial rebellions weren't rare accidents. They were built into a system where regional elites had real military capacity. Documents and charters sometimes forced kings to acknowledge noble rights, but the deeper issue was always leverage. If nobles controlled soldiers and castles, they could negotiate. If a king had strong finances, loyal administrators, and the ability to punish traitors, he could push back. Another useful detail is that noble armies weren't always national. A noble's men were loyal to him personally. That means medieval warfare could look like private conflict with royal branding. In border zones, nobles sometimes acted almost independently, raiding rivals, negotiating truces, and shaping local politics. For common people, this mattered because war wasn't only big battles. It was seasonal raids, burned crops, forced labor on fortifications, and sudden demands for supplies. When nobles fought each other, villagers paid the price. Yet nobles were also patrons. They funded churches, protected markets, sponsored tournaments, and sometimes enforced peace when it benefited them. Their role was contradictory by nature. They were protectors, exploiters, and political players all at once. Number 8. The king and the chain of rule. The king sat at the top, but medieval kingship was less like absolute control and more like managing a chain that could snap. In theory, all land ultimately belonged to the king, and everyone's loyalty flowed upward through oaths. In reality, the king's power depended on 3 things: resources, legitimacy, and enforcement. Resources meant money, grain, and the ability to mobilize troops without begging nobles every time. That's why kings cared about taxes, towns, and royal lands. Legitimacy meant being recognized as the rightful ruler, not just the strongest warlord. Coronations, sacred anointing, and church approval mattered because they turned political rule into something that felt cosmic. Enforcement meant having the strength to punish disloyalty through royal courts, loyal nobles, and sometimes professional soldiers. Strong kings built institutions. Officials who could collect revenue, judges who could apply royal law, and systems that reduced dependence on personal relationships alone. Weak kings relied heavily on nobles, which made them vulnerable to manipulation. The king's court was a political battlefield. Nobles competed for offices, marriages, and access because access meant influence. Kings used rewards like land grants, titles, and privileges to keep powerful families loyal. But every reward also strengthened someone who might later rebel. This is why medieval rule often looks like constant negotiation. Warfare was central to kingship because war was both a threat and a tool. A king needed to defend borders, punish rebels, and sometimes expand territory to reward supporters. Victories increased prestige and bargaining power. Defeats weakened authority, invited rebellion, and drained finances. Medieval armies also forced kings to think about logistics, roads, castles, ports, and supply lines. As warfare evolved from smaller feudal levies to larger campaigns needing paid troops, kings who could tap town wealth and manage administration gained an edge. That's one of the big turning points viewers can use. Feudalism works best when land-based service is enough, but as wars become longer, more expensive, and more complex, kings seek money, and money pulls power toward towns, taxes, and bureaucracy. When a kingdom collapsed, people often described it like the chain broke at the top, but the truth is, the whole structure depended on balance. If the king failed to reward nobles, if nobles oppressed peasants too harshly, if the church turned against the crown, or if trade collapsed, the entire pyramid shook. The king symbolized unity, but unity had to be constantly rebuilt through alliances, law, and force.